GlobalCollect today for this inaugural webinar series. We are going today to talk about the first in a series of payment strategies for BRIC presentations. This series will start now with a general overview of the payment strategies and different payment methods available in the different BRIC countries and how those markets behave. We will then follow up with this in the series later on with an in-depth deep dive into each country and go into a lot more detail per country. But that will be for future webinars. As a quick household tasks, I wanted to just get out of the way first. As you can tell, all lines are muted and will remain so for the duration of the presentation. Once the presentation is over, there will be a Q&A session, but during the presentation at any point in time, if you have a question, you can already submit it using the chat function or the question function. We will keep those and answer them once the presentation is finished. Today, the presenter will be John Snook. He is one of our overachieving product managers at GlobalCollect. He has 17 years of experience in developing products and bringing them to the market. He has studied business administration and political science at the University of Leiden, Erasmus University, and he also studied political philosophy in Barcelona. He's received a master's degree also at the University of Leiden. Mr. Snook has worked in the internet industry in various roles since 1994. And before joining GlobalCollect, he was the Director of Development at Branch Compass, where he successfully designed and developed various online tools for knowledge bases, business benchmarking, and e-learning for companies and trade associations. Throughout his career, he was also a consultant for the Dutch government on e-business strategies. And now he's also a person with an extensive expertise and knowledge in the domain of alternative payments. I will hand over the floor now to John so he can take you through the general overview of BRIC.
Okay, thank you, Daniel, for this thorough introduction. I might want to add that it took me 8 years to do all the studies, so if I'm overachieve, I am a slow one. But let's go to the payment strategies in BRIC. As Daniel already indicated, we have a whole webinar program around BRIC. And in this webinar, what we will be doing is give you a helicopter view of the 4 countries we're going to talk about, explore the payments and e-commerce landscape, and in the next months, we will have in-depth webinars where we dive deeper into the 4 countries. Before I go into the presentation, the main question to ask is why are we here for this presentation, for this webinar? And the reason is basically very simple, because those 4 BRIC countries show a tremendous growth in the last couple of years. Russia lagging a bit, but is catching up fast again. And also in terms of internet users, that's a tremendous growth, what we have seen in the last couple of years. So when we look at the e-commerce volume, maybe for some cases the absolute numbers are not that huge yet, but when we look at the growth figures, and of course depending on which publication you read, they might vary, but in the last couple of years the growth rate was between 30 and 40 to 50%. So the general consensus is that these are the growth figures of e-commerce in those countries. When we look at the volume, of course, China stands out in e-commerce volume, and also this growth rate is expected for the next couple of years in these 4 countries. Hence the reason why we take such an interest in these 4 countries. So what are the central themes we are going to talk about today? Basically 2. When we look at BRIC, they're very appealing markets, but at the same time very challenging. And also, as we are accustomed in the Western e-commerce markets, the credit cards dominate, and of course also in these 4 countries credit cards are a must-have, both international and local. Excuse me. But also, in many cases, the local alternatives can give you an extra checkout conversion of up to 30%. So I'm also going to spend some time on exploring those alternatives. Further down, what we're also going to do is looking at which factors to take into account when you're designing or optimizing your payment strategy in these 4 countries. So the framework or metaphor, if you will, I will be using throughout this presentation is basically the one we're going to talk about the payers, so the consumers, also the players in this one, and based on that, a general game plan which will help you designing your strategy. So before we go into the individual countries, I just want to spend some words on the similarities and differences on these countries, and what they all have in common, that they're relatively closed economies, and at the same time, as we just saw, a very high e-commerce growth. The closed economy is also shown by the restricted currencies, which cannot be repatriated or to a very low extent, and also that the government and the central banks are very dominant in these countries when it comes to the economy and also e-commerce. And also what we have to take into account is that these e-commerce infrastructures are less advanced than what we might have been used to, what we are used to in the more mature e-commerce countries. And the same goes for the payment products we have there, which are still in a build-up phase, also in terms of functionality. There's also various barriers with regard to legal, local entity, repatriation laws, foreign exchange, etc. And also what is known, although there are no conclusive figures on the exact amount of these countries, is that there's higher fraud and chargeback rates, and especially in Brazil, Russia, and India, they can be up to 2 or 3 times higher than in Europe or the US. We're going to look at the differences. I found a very useful study which I can recommend. It's the e-readiness study by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And what this report does, and don't worry, I won't go through it cell by cell. What this report does, they look into basically 6 factors which are crucial for the success or the failure of e-commerce and doing business on the internet. So there's connectivity, things like broadband, penetration, mobile phones, etc. How favorable is the business environment? And also, I forgot to add that, is in the last row you see the USA, and those are there for reference, so you can see the potential that is still in these 4 countries. But also, for example, like the government policy and vision. How favorable or how helping is the government in making sure the right framework is there for successful e-commerce? If you look at that, then you see that Brazil and India are a lot higher than, for example, Russia. And also looking at consumer and business adoptions. How do people use the internet? Do they transact on it? Brazil also scores the highest here, and India is the lowest. Again, very interesting report. So again, I would recommend it. Now, another way of looking at these 4 countries and see the differences, and which tells us something about the payment culture, is the debt versus savings per household. And here you can see, for example, Brazil, where the household has on average a 35% debt as opposed to the total income. And again, looking at the US, where it's 136%. And at Brazil, it tells us, as we will see later on, that they are more open to buy on credit. Also, when you look then to India, where there's a lot lower debt of the total household income, and they will see they choose payment methods where they spend the money they have and are less prone to credit. And that's also something you will see in the last 2 columns, where you have the credit cards per capita and the debit cards per capita. You see that the credit cards in India are very low. The same goes for Russia and China, and that it's quite high in Brazil, almost 1 per capita. And in China, for example, you see the debit cards are huge in total numbers. And of course, these people have more than 1 debit card. Look at the playing field. As I just in the introduction mentioned, if you have started in these countries, or want to start, you always start with the credit cards, but you want to get the full potential of these countries, then you need to look into the alternative payments if you want to get your checkout conversion at a higher rate. When you look at alternative payments, in many cases, you need to collect locally. And in order to be able to do that, you need a resident bank account. As a consequence, to open that one, you will need a local entity. And that's where the trouble starts. You will have additional administration and operational costs to be able to manage that entity and comply with all the local rules and laws that are attached to that. And also the type of entity you will open up there. Is it a full-blown operational entity, or is it a sort of an import-export type of entity? But this will determine how you need to repatriate and how you are taxed. In some of these countries, there are different tax regimes based on the industry you're in, for example, in telco or travel. So make sure you get your local advice who can tell you more on what is best fitting and will help you make the business case whether to set it up or not. And the last point in this case is the logistics. These are all very large countries with large rural areas where logistics are a lot more difficult than, for example, known in the US or in Europe. So a bit more, a couple of things to think about when you're talking about taxes and repatriation. One of the things is your product tangible or intangible? For example, just to give you a brief example, in Russia, if you sell intangible goods, digital goods in Russia without an entity, you don't need to pay VAT. Unless, for example, you have servers there which are seen as a permanent establishment. Now this is just an example of how nuanced it may be whether to go into a country or not. Another thing is your customer a consumer or is it a business? That's also determines, for example, the type of information you need to collect, for example, in the case of Brazil. And the whole legislation around VAT in withholding tax can be quite complex. So again, and I cannot stress it enough, is get your local advice to help you through that. Now also, if you have a local entity and you want to get your collected funds out of that country, there is data to be collected which you need to have as a background for reporting to either the central bank or the government, or in the case of Brazil, your local bank, which will act as a tax agent. You need to capture all kinds of data like fiscal number, name, address, in order to get your money out of the country. Now, of course, this all brings an operational impact with you, and there's a trade-off basically between the frequency of reporting and repatriating your money versus the foreign exchange exposure you might risk. So doing daily reporting and daily repatriation will be, in most cases, too much hassle and won't be justified by the revenues it brings. However, if you do it once a month, you might have more to deal with cash flow problems and currency exposure. So again, there's a trade-off which you need to take into account if you're going into these countries. So this was the general introduction of these 4 countries and the landscape. Right now we're going into Brazil, where people are very prone to buy things on credit. And of course, the thing you need to have there is installments. parcelas in my best Portuguese. So that is absolutely, if you're selling things above $100, this is very important for your success in Brazil to do business. Now, of course, there are a lot of credit cards and debit cards going around, but not everyone in Brazil has a card or is eligible for credit. So to put it really black and white, it's either cash or cards what you do in Brazil. And we are seeing alternatives from the banking and from the e-wallet side taking a larger part of the payment mix. But in general, you start with cards, then you add cash, and then you go for, in the third round, for the e-wallets and all kinds of bank transfer and real-time banking. Now, as mentioned before, there's also a relatively high number of chargebacks in Brazil. And in this slide, you can see an overview of the important players. Of course, you all recognize the international cards. And there's also Hipercard and Aura, which are big local cards in Brazil. When we talk about banks, we talk about Boleto, and I will tell you a bit more in the next slide about this. And we have, for example, Itaú and Bradesco, which are the main banks in Brazil. Talking about alternatives, there's many. Of course, there's PayPal, recently started there and trying to get a foothold there. And other mentionable names are Dinero Mail and Mercado Pago. So looking a bit further into the players, the big star of the alternatives is Boletos, which is basically a bank scheme where all the banks participate in. And what it is a barcode which is generated online, and it is a push payment. So basically, the transaction generates a barcode, the consumer prints it out, and then we'll have to wait until he makes the payment, either via his online banking, he goes to his bank branch, he pays by check, or he goes to an ATM where the barcode is scanned and he feeds in the cash to make the payment. Now, when we look at the pie chart on the right side, you see the market share of online payment methods, and this is the general one, where you see that cards is 60% and Boletos is 30%. But depending on your transaction value or your target audience, these shares might differ. For example, if you have a higher transaction value, it is more likely that the cards will be a higher percentage of your payment mix, also because of the installments option. Boletos is for lower transaction value, but also if you're doing business with other businesses, the Boletos percentage might be higher because from an administration point of view, it is more favorable for them to use a Boletos because it acts as an invoice at the same time. Now, there's also some contenders to the oligopoly of these two payment methods. Those are the e-wallets, Mercado Pago and Dinero Mail. Although they're still small in terms of volume, their growth rate, which is up to 50 to 100% year on year, shows their promise for the future. And another one is Debito Online, which is basically real-time banking with the various banks in Brazil. Now, as a little help, I've put these in a table, which I divided based on the industry, digital goods, physical goods, or travel, and the appealingness of each payment method. So while I'll take a sip of drink, just please have a look at these to see what might fit your business. Taking a closer look at the various alternatives, also a basic overview of the functionality. As you can see, Boletos, e-wallets, and bank transfers are not reversible by the consumer. For Boletos, it can be if it's paid by a check and the check bounces. And also looking at the money back refund, meaning if you want to refund a transaction, that you use the same payment method as what it was paid with. So with boletos, that is not necessarily possible. For e-wallets, it can be in bank transfer, of course, as well. In terms of functionality of recurring, for the e-wallet, it's being developed. But if you will have a recurring model, then cards will be your main payment offering. So summarizing this into the game plan, if you have the local bank transfers, the e-wallets and the boletos, you could see an average uplift of about 25 to 35%. And again, depending on your transaction value and your business model, that might differ. But as a general rule of thumb, this is what you might expect. Also look at your industry requirements, meaning how much tax you would need to pay. And again, the local entity and capturing consumer data is a really important point to note. Brazilian real cannot be repatriated. So unless you have the resources and knowledge internally, I would recommend to outsource it to a third party, be it a bank or a PSP. So traveling from Brazil to Russia. Russia is different in the sense that here you can safely say that cards are the alternative form of payment. So some background on the payers in Russia. They really love their cash. This comes from mainly from the banking crisis in 1998, where people lost the pension and the savings. So there's still a distrust of banks, although it's improving in that sense. The culture is cash. As a substitute to make online payments, people prefer e-wallets, where they fund an e-wallet and make the payment. That's also one of the products I'm going to talk about. WebMoney started in 1998 as an alternative for people to send each other money online instead of via banks. Most online purchases are digital, but travel is growing really, really fast. So that's important to take into account. And also, many of the cards that are issued in Russia are not enabled for online transactions, or they're not enabled for international transactions. Most of the cards are basically prepaid cards where people receive their salary or their pension, and they use it just to get the money out of the ATM to get their beloved cash there. What we do see, however, is that cross-border payments are growing, and that has a direct relation with the e-wallets, who make it a lot easier to do cross-border payments. And the estimates are about that 20 to 25% of total volume is cross-border. So who are the main players here? There's a couple of banks, Sberbank and Alpha Bank, Raiffeisen we have there, and the alternatives in the form of e-wallets, Moneta, Yandex, WebMoney, RBK Money, and the little terminals you see there is the one from Kiwi. And that is a cash-in terminal where you touch the screen and make a payment for your ISP bill, top of your prepaid phone, or make a purchase directly. So this is a piece of research from 2009, or the data is based on 2009, on the preference of online payment methods. And immediately we see that the cash on delivery declined, and the one that benefited for that is the e-money, so the e-wallets and the terminal payments of this world. You see a small decline for credit cards and bank transfers. So looking at the stars in payments in Russia, of course we have Yandex, part of Yandex Search, which is basically the Google of Russia, and they are the #1 form of payment. They only do in rubles. Close number 2 is WebMoney, also an e-wallet. They have multiple currencies, euro, US dollar, ruble of course, and they also have a currency like WebMoney Gold, where you can, where it's tied to the gold rate. The big contender here, and the way I look at it, is that they, in a couple of years, they will be overtaking both e-wallets, and that's Kiwi. Those are the ATMs. They've got about 120,000 ATMs throughout Russia, and they have 80 million unique visitors per month who will make their payments using those ATMs. Now they also developed an e-wallet where they go into the direct competition with WebMoney and Yandex. Now they act as funding sources for those e-wallets, but you also can buy Visa prepaid, which you can use online or make a direct payment. So again, the overview here of based on the type of business you're in and the attractiveness of the various payment methods. So special look at travel, where Yandex and WebMoney are somewhat attractive, but for the higher transaction values, again, it is cards. For example, Yandex has a limit on the amount per transaction, which can be lifted if the consumer verifies himself by sending his ID or going to a specific retail chain to allow that. Good thing about these alternative products is that they are not reversible, except for mobile, but that is a really, really small portion of the payments. And the money back refund is possible with WebMoney and Kiwi. Recurring is available at Yandex and WebMoney, and not yet at Kiwi. So looking at Russia, what would be the game plan? If you have an ATV of under around $500 US, adding Yandex, WebMoney, and Kiwi will give you an average increment in your checkout conversion of 40 to 50%. If you're in travel, cards are your main pick, and for physical goods, there needs to be a culture shift in Russia where first people would like to get the goods and then make the payment. Setting up a local entity would require a lot of go to a lot of red tape and bureaucracy, and you need to get a tax passport in order to repatriate the money. You can have a non-resident account, but the settlement will take up to 30 days. There's even more paperwork involved, and not all local vendors or acquirers would want to work with you because of the complexity involved. So that closes off Russia. 2 more countries to go, and now we're going into India. And India is basically the sleeping giant. Everybody's waiting for the moment that they really reach their potential. There are some signs that it's starting to take off now. This is a very useful piece of information from the Indian Internet Trade Association, where they investigated all the transactions. And what you see here is that they looked at the active Internet users, the ones that looked for information but did not buy. And in the end, there's 7.4 million who have bought a product or service on the Internet. And this is growing at a healthy rate. So what can we say about the payers? The people who buy online are usually more educated and living in metropolitan areas. Also, the age demographic is important. 85% of the people who shopped online are between 15 and 35. Now, what's interesting to see is look at the demographic evolvement, is that in 2015, 65% of the population will fall in that age category. So that would mean that there's a large number of people going into that, coming into that market. India is always pictured as the poster child for mobile, where everybody expects them to leapfrog the PC desktop directly to mobile. We need to nuance that a bit, because most of these mobile phones are your conventional phones and not the smartphones where you could do internet browsing. So also, again, the potential is there, but we need to put that into perspective. So looking a bit more at the culture. First and foremost, I think the most of all the 4 countries we're talking about today is trust. So that has to be in your website, in how you deal with customers, etc. What research also shows that once people have had good shopping experiences, they are more inclined to make more purchases. One of the main barriers of not transacting online, first of all, is the lack of trust, and second is the non-delivery as well as the logistics that are not optimal always. As a way of trying to build trust, the Reserve Bank of India, the Central Bank of India, introduced in July 2009 the two-factor authentication for card non-present transactions. What happened was, in general, that the success rates declined, but at the same time, the number of people paying online grew. So it basically it plateaued, but in terms of volume, it grew tremendously. And since February 2011, the two-factor authentication is also available for mobile or interactive voice response systems, basically ordering via your phone. When we talk about two-factor authentication, it's of course the 3D secure method, but also banks are handing out tokens or one-time passwords using SMS as a means of authentication. From the same research I just talked about, there was a survey on the preferred payment methods, or what they use and what they use most. Now, what you see here is that debit card via internet banking and credit card are the two main ones. Then we have the basically the cash on delivery, or the post payment, and there's the prepaid cash cards. As you can see, in terms of usage, demand draft and mobile payments are still at a low percentage. So who are the main players? The Reserve Bank of India, very active in the e-commerce, setting regulations and licensing. So they are the driving force, well, depends on who you talk to, of e-commerce in India. The big star is basically the Indian banks via net banking. Now, on the right side of the screen in the pie chart, I looked at the, and this is public information, at the market shares of payment methods of the Indian Railway Company, which is basically the biggest single e-commerce company in India. They account for about 25 to 30% of all online payments. There you see a huge preference for net banking. Then come cards, and then the prepaid cash cards. Also take into account that the average transaction value is relatively low, so not comparable, for example, to an airline where you would see a different payment mix. All things being said about mobile, still they're being seen as the big contender to grow into a star in India as a payment method. When we talk about mobile, it's carrier billing or link your card or bank account to your mobile phone and then make the payment. So this part, I'll briefly go through it. I think by now you know the recipe. Of course, you will have access to this presentation later on, so you can take your time to study it. And if there's any questions, just send your account manager or myself an email, and we're happy to help you. So the game plan, again, if you have net banking, cash cards, and if you're into gaming, you have mobile, then your average increment can be up to 20%. But net banking is the main one next to cards. Is your company ready for mobile? Do you have a mobile site? Also looking at the target audience you are trying to reach and their usage of mobile. Very important, I cannot stress it enough, is trust. Might be good to have a look at the checkout pages of the IRCTC, the Indian Railway Company, to get an idea of what Indian consumers are used to when they're shopping and paying online. So the last country for today, China. I didn't have as dramatic a title for China. The only thing that comes to mind for me is growing, and they keep growing, and they already top the world in terms of number of internet users, 457 million. And also, for example, what you see of the number of people who paid online, when you look at the right side of the screen. In December 2009, it was 94 million. 6 months later, it was 128 million at a growth rate of 36%. So, and that seems to still be accelerating. So this is, if you're not already there, this is the time to really go into China with your offering of your products. Also here, cash and cash on delivery is preferred first and foremost. Also here, in terms of age, you see that the people under 35 are more prone to buy on credit and also buy online. And also something important to keep in mind that with the debit cards, which a lot of people in China have, the transaction limits, there are transaction limits, for example, of about $1,000 or less. Main players, China UnionPay, basically the monopolist in terms of issuing and the whole acquiring channel, and the alternatives, or better known as third-party gateways, Alipay and Tenpay. And Tencent is the parent company of Tenpay. So are the stars, of course, China UnionPay when it comes to cards, and Alipay when it comes to the alternatives. In the chart, or in the pie chart on the right side, you see they account for 49% of the transaction volume of third-party payments. Tenpay is at 22%, growing even faster than Alipay, so they can be seen as the biggest contender. Mobile also growing tremendously, 200% year on year. Currently there are 303 million people who use the mobile to browse the internet. And all these payment methods we see here have developed or are developing their payment pages to use on a mobile. So when you pick your team of payments, of course it's cards, it's Alipay and Tenpay. With those three you will have a great coverage. Again, also what we saw with alternative payments in other countries, the functionality, for example, on recurring or delayed settlements is not yet there. But also what's good to know, Alipay and Tenpay, they are not reversible. And you can use the same method to refund money back to the consumer. And when it says Alipay, yes, not real time, that means as soon as you initiate the refund, it won't go from Alipay account to the consumer's Alipay account. There's a check in between by Alipay. If they allow it, then they will send the refund through to the consumer's Alipay account. So what's the game plan? You have cards, you add Alipay and Tenpay, you can expect an increment of about 30 to 40%. Also, is your website ready for mobile? And also take into account that we have to deal with the Chinese mobile phones. And I think when it comes to setting up an entity in China, it's quite cumbersome. I think it's the most complex of the 4 countries we talk about in setting up an entity there, and taxes are approximately 30%. So this closes off the going over the various countries. Just 2 more slides to summarize, and then we're open for questions. So markets and product functionality is not at the stage or level that everybody would like it to see, but they're getting there. Again, I will stress it, seek local tax and legal advice, because these are complex countries, and also in certain cases the e-commerce legislation is not as clear and specific to e-commerce as everybody would like. If you have your local entity and you need to repatriate, think about the reporting requirements and the necessary data you need to capture. And this will impact your checkout process. So the basic question is, these countries are attractive, yet complex. Do you have the ability and the wish to do it yourself, or do you outsource it to another company who will take care of that for you? And also match your business with the forms of payments that support your needs in terms of pricing, recurring, delayed settlement. Do you want to be reversible or not, etc. And last but certainly not least, trust and transparency and clarity is even more important in these countries than in the more developed e-commerce countries. So have a clear refund policy, have a clear complaint policy, because the people on the forums are very quick to share their bad experiences and thereby impacting your reputation online. So this is the presentation about BRIC. Before I hand over to Daniel, I'll just do a pitch because of the next webinars. And the next webinar, which we announce very soon, is Brazil in Depth, and will be done by our host for today, Daniel Belda, born and raised in Brazil. And also, we will be announcing next week a webinar on gaming in BRIC. So Daniel, over to you.
Thank you, John, for this very enlightening session. I hope everybody has the same feeling as I have, which answered a lot of my questions. Although there are still some questions we got during the presentations, John, so if you don't mind, I'll start with those. And in the meantime, if anybody else has more questions, you can type them in, and I'll make sure they are answered by John. I'll start with one which is not per se related to BRIC itself, but when you were presenting Russia, you mentioned that the cash and wallet-based business, and the question was if in Eastern Europe the same applies.
To a certain extent, yes, especially when you look at the credit card penetration, which is very low. You do have branded prepaid cards, because in that it's comparable with Russia, where people get the salaries on those prepaid cards. And it's not for nothing that the Eastern European countries are seen as, call it prepaid heaven. That it is a similar culture where cash is king, but also slowly people are using online banking to make online payments and payments in general.
Okay, and as a follow-up question to that one was with relation to the credit cards, if there also applies that they're not really enabled for web purchases.
That is something that I don't know. I would expect, given the proliferation of credit cards at all, which is quite low in these countries, and the dominance of prepaid or debit cards, it is not all are enabled, because especially for cross-border payments in general, those are seen as more risky payments when it comes to chargebacks versus non-delivery. You see more and more that it is basically, together with online banking, the only way to pay online. And also, I think that's one of why the growth in those countries in terms of e-commerce is not as big. But again, this is very general knowledge I have on these specific countries when it comes to credit cards. So it's not. We could find it out. So if you could note it down, and we can answer that in a later stage, Daniel.
Yes, I shall have it noted, and we'll get back to the person at a later stage. As a separate question now, one of the questions is, what is the level of taxes to repatriate money from Brazil, Russia, India?
Sorry, could you repeat that? Excuse me.
The question is, how much are the taxes, the repatriation taxes, in the different countries?
Brazil, from the top of my mind, 25 to 27%. China 30%. India 12.5%. Russia is that also depends. Could be up to 30%. But yeah, Russia, I'm not sure. I think there are various percentages also depending on the business you're in. If you have an entity, how you have set up that entity. So yeah, alas, I have to be a bit more vague on that one. But yeah, it is maximum 30%. But I've seen instances where it's a lot less.
Okay. The next question, which is following up on this repatriation tax, is a question if it differs by digital or physical goods. If there's a different repatriation tax depending on what it is, if it's physical or digital, and with the more specific in Brazil.
In Brazil, there are differences, but it's not so much digital, physical, but it's the type of industry you're in. And you have to excuse me that again, this is a question I would ask our tax manager to look into that, but there are differences there for sure.
Okay. Now, the next question is more related to our roadmap and how it relates to the BRIC countries. One question here is, you mentioned in your presentations Kiwi.
Yep.
And the question is, how soon do you think we will be able to see that in our portfolio?
As soon as we come to agreement with Kiwi. So yes, we are having positive talks with them. So of course it's difficult to say right now how soon, but it is one of the things that is one of my personal things which I think for our Russia offering would really complete our offering there, and also looking at the near future where they play a more dominant role. It is high on our wish list in that sense.
And the follow-up to that question was, what about Mercado Pago in Latin America?
Both Dinero Mill and Mercado Pago is companies where we are in advanced talks with. Again, those are on our roadmap. And again, how soon depends on getting the contract done, but that's looking very promising. And then, yeah, the mutual planning of resources to get this project developed and into the market. But these are all things that are in an advanced stage to complete, and to deliver to the market.
Okay. Now we're going back a bit to Brazil. I apologize for that. Well, the question is, what are the main reasons why the chargeback rate in Brazil is so high?
Ooh, that's a good question. And usually people say it's a good question if they don't know the exact answer, which is also the case now. Yeah, there are various reasons. It could be the fraud detection, or the part of it is just non-delivery, or people who are not happy with the product they get. That also goes into the trust factor. So that's one of the things that I have read about. Another thing that you could imagine is that if people live on credit and they don't get by at the end of the month, it is possible that they are not able to make the payment and then try to dispute payments. But again, I'm sorry for the lame answer here. I don't know the exact reasons. But again, that is something I can ask internally with our cards product manager. Will definitely be able to tell you that the main reasons for that. So I also want to note down and get back to the audience with.
Okay, I shall definitely keep this noted so we can get back to the person that was asking the question. In addition to that, the next question we have is again regarding the repatriation tax, and it is to know if having a local entity in Brazil helps withholding or helps make a corporation exempt from the withholding tax if they transfer the profits to the corporation abroad.
Yeah, well, it's not being exempt from tax. Also, if you the tax, you need to pay taxes. The difference is that, and this is speaking from somebody who has no extensive knowledge on accounting and taxations, but it's basically you have your cost, you have your turnover, and that has a profit. If you repatriate it, you have to pay the money in Brazil, but if there's a how do you call it, avoidance of double tax in your home country, you wouldn't need to pay double taxes. But again, I'm on thin ice here to the exact way how it works. So again, please ask your tax advisor to look into that, because I'm very hesitant to be giving tax advice here.
I agree with you, John. Also, as a Brazilian, I tend to think that taxes in Brazil are inevitable. It's a fact of life. But I think that concludes all the questions we had outstanding. So if there is nothing else coming in, I will then like to thank you all for participating in this webinar. I hope it was useful for you. We definitely will be continuing with these series. As I mentioned before, and as John mentioned before, we'll be doing a more detailed presentation on Brazil. Also upcoming is already a webinar on the gaming market with some interesting information based on some research that we've recently done. So all in all, we see these webinars continuing in a frequent basis for the foreseeable future. So if you enjoyed this one and found it useful, please keep your eyes open for the next one. So thank you very much, and we'll be closing this webinar off in another 2 minutes. One last thing I forgot to mention is that the presentation itself will also be made available online afterwards, and we'll send you a link with the location of the presentation. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you.